Great, we did it. It's a miracle. Okay, so let's just go in the order, yeah, that it was announced. So Sam will go first, and yeah, like about 5 minutes, everybody, so we make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion and yakking at the end. And when I show my phone like this with the timer, it means you're out of time, okay? All right. Sam, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, go for it.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, good. Yeah, so thanks so much to the organizers, Rebecca and Dylan, for bringing us together for this discussion on a very important topic. And hello to my fellow panelists. It's great to be in a room with a bunch of old colleagues and friends. And yeah, we've been given the impossible task of sharing our papers in 5 minutes. So I'm just going to jump right in. So for those of you who haven't been following the news, in recent weeks, India has witnessed a historic uprising spearheaded by a satirical movement called the Cockroach People's Party, involving hundreds of thousands of mostly youth from across the country. These protests began in response to a major medical entrance exam leak and then a tragic wave of student suicides, but have expanded to include a searing critique of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has been at the nation's helm for the past 12 or so years. And in this context, some commentators have been sounding the death knell of the current far-right regime. And while I share the optimism for the self-identified cockroaches and would be absolutely overjoyed if this movement were to evolve into a full-blown revolution, such sanguine assessments are unfortunately premature. This is because, as we'll see more about in a moment, the strength of Hindu nationalism is in fact vastly greater than the charismatic appeal of individual demagogues like Narendra Modi. I title this presentation Fascism as Hegemony because the Hindu supremacists, much more than their far-right counterparts from around the world, including Trump slash MAGA, share many of the classical traits of fascism. Ideologically and genealogically, the Hindu supremacists borrow directly from the legacies of Mussolini and Hitler. Crucially, the movement sustains a thick institutional associationism held together by the Sangh Parivar and started by a century-old paramilitary organization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. And the structural depth of this network allows the BJP to, the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP-led regime, to seamlessly fuse an institutional state repression with decentralized vigilante violence. At the same time, unlike the interwar fascisms, which emerged as a reaction or engagement with organized proletarian and robust left parties, India's ruling bloc lacks such an imminent and organized threat. This fact has sort of enabled the far right to achieve a relatively sort of stable hegemonic bloc, consisting both of dominant and dominated social groups and forces. So I build on the theoretical interventions of Stuart Hall in this paper. And Stuart Hall argues that under certain historical contexts, class struggle and hegemonic warfare can operate through the rubric of race, or the modality of race. And in the Indian context, in this paper, I show how hegemony is fundamentally caste articulated. Caste is not only a key structuring agent of contemporary society, but it's also the primary locus through which the hegemonic bloc is expressed, and also through which the counter-hegemonic currents are disarticulated. And this brings us to a key contradiction of the Hindu fascist project, which is how does a party that's historically led by an upper caste elite construct a national popular around Hindu unity in a society defined by extreme economic inequality and regnant caste violence. Prevailing scholarship suggests the regime simply suppresses caste to sort of articulate a broader Hindu unity and to protect upper caste privilege, utilizing clientelist welfare handouts to pacify lower caste subalterns. But my ethnographic research in Kerala and UP reveal more sophisticated set of mechanisms at play. So first, the BJP ruthlessly adapts its strategy to the distinct realities of subnational political fields, treating caste grievances not with doctrinal purity, but with tactical flexibility. Moreover, it modifies its own strategy to respond to the failures of past parties to ameliorate caste oppression. And more specifically, when traditional left and identity-based coalitions fail to advance transformative approaches to caste, or when they offer what I call unidimensional solutions to the multidimensional inequalities of caste, they create structural vacuums. And the ethno-nationalist right adeptly steps into this void. In Kerala, the BJP operates as an insurgent counter-hegemon against an entrenched social democratic establishment. Historically, the communist parties in Kerala advanced a caste-blind redistributive program that achieved material gains, but failed to dismantle the spatial marginalization of lower caste people or Dalits, effectively subsuming caste identity into a universalizing class struggle. And in response, the BJP deploys what I call a determinant articulation, where they actively weaponize Dalit subjectivity, co-opting localized idioms of subaltern resistance, and deliberately fueling an oppositional, highly visible Dalit identity that fractures the left's universalizing dominance. In Uttar Pradesh or UP, the BJP acts as an established hegemon, and here they respond to a sort of institutional legacy of identity-based politics, or that which is led by the Bahujan Samaj Party, which was elected to power in UP several times in the 90s and the early 2000s, and historically offered a sort of symbolic representation and recognition to Dalit voters, but failed to deliver a meaningful material redistribution. And in both cases, the BJP, oh, sorry, I missed a point. So, the BJP in UP deploys a subsumptive articulation where they attempt to demobilize specific Dalit grievances, and they deliver a targeted welfare program where they simultaneously use state repression to crush autonomous counter hegemonic Dalit uprisings while also responding to material needs and grievances through the delivery of rations and housing. And in both cases, the BJP builds a base by seamlessly weaving together the material concessions with symbolic recognition for caste-oppressed people. So just to kind of conclude and wrap this up, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but the cockroaches and waves of protest before them are showing that the regime is not unshakable. And they've forced some very serious and rare concessions from the regime, and for the first time effectively challenged the state's propaganda machine. But at the same time, my research shows that Hindu fascism succeeds not simply by, brainwashing caste-differentiated groups, but by embedding themselves in civil society and responding to the genuine material grievances and cultural indignities that traditional parties and coalitions have neglected. Their articulations on caste are not ideologically rigid, but rather politically promiscuous and tailored responses to the legacies of these past political formations. The upshot is that this regime cannot be defeated through street protest or ideological critique alone. They must be combated in, deep in the trenches of civil society, to borrow a phrase from Gramsci. And finally, if this movement, or any future movement for that matter, is to become a counter-hegemonic force, they will have to directly confront the messy realities of caste instead of, shying away from, that complexity as some on the left are advocating. And just to sum it up, the key takeaway is that a multidimensional and transformative approach to longstanding ethno-racial inequalities is what's needed to produce a power capable of defeating ethno-nationalist hegemony. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much. Sam, can you I forgot to have everybody introduce themselves at the beginning. Can you introduce yourself here at the end? Because it'll go on the website and then it'll be good to have everyone's affiliation and stuff.
Sure, yeah. So I'm an assistant professor at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY at City University of New York.
Yeah, Samantha Agarwal. Okay, everybody remember to introduce themselves at the beginning. Who's next on the list? I think it's Müge, right?
Yep,
Yeah, and introduce yourself at the beginning, okay?
sure. I'm Fatma Müge Göçek, Department of Sociology, University of Michigan. And I'm a full professor, I guess, senior, and so to speak. So I was thinking about the right turn in U.S. higher education, and I'm using this opportunity to try to develop a global critical theory around Du Bois's articulation of double consciousness, in the sense that I think Du Bois was able to put together not only the top-down perception of Black people by the whites, but also the bottom-up perception of Black people of themselves. And I thought this would be a good way to bring in not only the top-down hegemonic forces, but rather also to bring in from the bottom-up the other ones. I mean, to counterbalance and destabilize, hopefully, the top-down one. And the way I applied this to U.S. higher education was to consider, on the one side, the structural elements, which I thought formed around neoliberal capitalism, of trying to transform, society, and with it, higher education from the top down. And I also thought, since I was, after all, a person who had the experience of living in this society for a long time and operating within higher education at a public university, to also bring in my perspective, my experience from the bottom up. So the paper itself, therefore, has two elements. One is structural, and the other one is experiential. Structurally, I argue that neoliberalism is politically conservative, as it prioritizes profits and the marketplace over social science, service distribution and the public good, increasing the wealth of shareholders at the expense of the collective well-being. I then discuss the adverse neoliberal impact of this on U.S. higher education, and I discuss it more detail in the paper, but here I'll just sort of move on to the experiential part. Experientially, I reflect on my experience as a sociology professor at the University of Michigan and as a U.S. social scientist in the field, publishing in journals and attending annual meetings of professional associations. And I argue that my academic experience mirrors the conservative neoliberal turn in the United States in general and U.S. higher education in particular. So when we look at it structurally, what I did was I actually did a survey of what has been published on neoliberalism in general and on neoliberalism in higher education in particular, and came up with more than 100 books. I only could do the book level because the article level would just have been too much. And I was able to then look at literally 61 works that were written in the last decade to look at the adverse impact. And as Lawrence Bush, for example, articulates, the market-like changes that have been instituted as shifting the cost of education from the state to individual students, redefining higher education as a search for the highest job, turning scholarly research into an individualized form of competition based on a wide range of metrics, such as number of citations, the value of grants, the number of patents, instituting national and global competitions among universities and research institutes for funding and prestige, and increasing the numbers and enhancing the power and salaries of administrators in return for pursuing these market-like objectives, most often at the expense of faculty salaries. So this is, I think, what has happened, and as a consequence, the sort of mission of universities to distribute knowledge rather than pay, find jobs, marketable jobs for their students has shifted. Now, experientially, then I turned on to my own experience at the University of Michigan to see how this shift also was reflected at the university that I know. And I think, I thought, according to my own perception, the changing organization, the turn to the right actually started in the aftermath of the 9/11 2001 attacks, with an increase in the securitization of the campus, which is like a big part of neoliberal sort of parameter, as we now see with Trump as well. And our literature, science, and arts building was like securitized against possible terrorist attacks. There were cards, you could only enter with cards and such. And the corporatization of this securitization commenced during and after the 2008 financial crisis, when many businesses that could no longer operate in the faltering corporate world discovered public universities, or universities in general, as a new financial resource to exploit. Corporate consultants arrived with their corporate model to make the university more efficient and cost-effective, as if that were the fundamental goal of higher education, instead of knowledge production and dissemination. And gradually all different units at our large university were administratively centralized, and decision-making power moved away from the departments, first to the literature, science, and arts, and then bypassing the provost to the university president. Yet the presidential power was limited and controlled by the ultimate decision-making body, namely the Board of Regents. And then I do an analysis of who the Board of Regents are, because they ultimately are the ones who sort of, legitimate and put into effect all the policies. And it is interesting that the Board of Regents, I argue, and not only encouraged but also actualized move to of the University of Michigan to the right, due to their structural compositions. If you look at the regents, pretty much who are in the state of Michigan elected by biennial statewide elections, they comprise almost entirely of business people. Of the 8 members, 4 practice law, 1 owns a venture capital firm, 1 a government relations and lobbying firm, 1 manages corporations, and 1 manages investments at a private financial firm. And of those, there is only 1 who is a faculty member, who teaches at a law school and is a lawyer herself. And she is also the only Black woman member on board. So I argue the board reflects the corporate mindset, but also conservative status quo preserving stamp that comes with it. And this became very evident, especially with the pro-Palestinian, movement of students that they came upon very harshly. And now we have, for the first time, security vans that have been circulating and monitoring the campus 24/7 constantly. That has just happened over the summer. This also impacted our department. Previously, the department had its own computer consultant, financial officer, and we could get any technological help in the department. But then basically these were taken away first to LSNA and then to centralized university services, so that we have no idea now who the financial person is, who the computer person is, and we only deal with them, and I have no idea. I've never set my eyes on them, or I don't even know where they are on campus. I mean, so that is a sort of a kind of alienation. And they said this in the name of efficiency, of course, but that meant that they did not at all take into account our access to them, which of course was much more important for us.
Okay, you're just at time, so
Okay,
wrap up
okay.
when
So
you can. Yeah, great.
I'll wrap up. Within the sociology department, the decision-making criteria also changed. Enrollments in especially undergraduate courses are anxiously monitored to increase the number of students, as we had more access to university funds based on these figures. There are also enrollment thresholds about all the courses we can teach. We cannot have, for example, we cannot teach a course with less than 6 students in it. And then our graduate program also suffers the most, as we admit and enroll less and less students in sociology proper, and can get more students through joint programs with other units. Funding for graduate students also became increasingly challenging, and prioritizing cost to the university over the need and diversity of graduate students. And we are recruiting more and more from the wealthy suburbs of Michigan, and affluent national and international students. So the burden of tuition, because of the burden of tuition being at the university. I also then turned from that to the social sciences, and what I have experienced, a transformation in content, especially in journals that focus on reproducing conservative mainstream sociology at the expense of diverse critical sociology, one that's fostered and financed by academic presses. And there are two significant right turns that I saw. One of them is what happened at Theory and Society. I'm sure you know of that, so I will not go into it. But then the other one that I do know personally is the Social Science History Association and the journal associated with it. The association and its journal attempted to diversify away from the hegemony of white scholars located at the top public and private U.S. educational institutions. They hired a faculty member with express intent to diversify the journal content, yet the SSHA board did not support this faculty member when they exposed the irregular desk rejection of the critical articles that she had submitted to SSH by two white males, one an editor and the other an administrator. Rather than supporting her attempts to diversify the journal, they fired her after 3 years into her 6-year term. When some faculty objected, the SSHA board did not change their decision, choosing to retain the status quo, and that is predicated on promoting their mainstream careerist choices over the ideals of diversity. So that is the other one. So if you look at also the problem now we're having with ASA and the annual meetings, I mean, I think this is very much also predicated on the neoliberal term, in the sense that membership fees have constantly escalated to reach upper 3 figures, with an equal amount now charged for attending annual meetings. Associations also need to sign a contract with hotels for meeting accommodation, and the cost of hotel rooms is also at a minimum 3 figures per night. So you have to pay literally 1,000 for transportation, another 1,000 for hotel, and probably another, so it's basically up to $3,000 to just attend an ASA meeting. And that, of course, is going to be more and more problematic going forward, because they also do not want to have online virtual attendance, because they have to have physical bodies in the hotels to be able to recover, I guess, the cost of being there. And in addition, current neoliberal US foreign policy has also alienated many international scholars who were either not let into the United States or surveilled upon entrance. A recent sociology faculty visitor we have from Spain recounted having to show their social media and their academic work to US Border Patrol upon entrance. And many international studies have no interest also in coming to the US because of the aggressive exclusionary stand of the current government. So I think in general then you see both a structural turn and in general in higher education, and that is reflected also in our lives as scholars, as sociologists. Thank you. That's it.
Great, thank you. Who did I say was next? Ho-Fung?
I think it's me. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for organizing this in this chaotic times, and I think it all kind of comfort with this intellectual space. I'm Ho-Fung, and I teach at Johns Hopkins University in both sociology and the School of Advanced International Studies. And my other title right now is the sitting president of the SSHA. After all the unfortunate turmoil that Müge succinctly described, and me and my colleagues are doing very hard to reform and to remedy all the problems that is described. It is not going to be quick, but it is taking time, and we just passed a new constitution by vote, and hopefully, and I hope, and we have this as our goal to make it better and do the reform necessary, and then at some point in the future that you. And many other people who have issues in the past, and will find that we have changed enough to come back. But it's not what I'm talking about today. But I changed the subtitle of the paper a little bit for the interest of time. I'm not sharing my slides, just talking. So it is the liberal democracy as a white privilege. And the subtitle is From Jim Crow America to Post-Miracle China. Basically, that I'm dealing with these issues on the liberal democracy, and on the liberal democracy, and I'm not sure whether I'm talking about right turn or left turn, because in this kind of tricky issue, it's very difficult to tell left from right. Sometimes some left position is actually converged with the right position, because like in the 1990s, there's two famous, now kind of notorious books people criticize about, and one is actually, of course, Francis Fukuyama, the End of History and the Last Man. It is very celebrating the triumph of Western liberal democracy as a global universal form of political system, and of course also free market as well. And he's optimistic that it will automatically and peacefully become the system everybody adopt, and if thing doesn't work very well, it seems to be in the early 2000s, and Fukuyama shift to a new conservative position to support U.S. promoting liberal democracy through military intervention, the second war in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So it is seen as a conservative position, but actually at the same time, when Fukuyama published this book, there is another famous book, of course, it is Huntington Clash of Civilization, that many people will talk about his essentially his conception of civilizational difference, so on and so forth, without discussing much about his remedy. His remedy is actually a MAGA, or anticipating a MAGA agenda, that at the end of the book, and he said that there are some people, some civilization that is hopeless to have liberal democracy, particularly Chinese and Islamic civilization. So they are incompatible with a liberal democracy. So he advocates give up promoting democracy in those places. They cannot have democracy, and then at the same time to homogenize the domestic internal polity and culture of the Western liberal democratic society. And then his famous or infamous saying is, of course, that to make sure that the U.S. maintain its core identity, which is Anglo-Protestant identity. So and then he later on published another book, Who Are We, and then advocated kind of a assimilationist, anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism kind of agenda. And then the foreign policy implication of that agenda is really that you homogenize at home, at the same time stop intervening on world stage and forget about democracy. So when you deal with the dictator, you don't need to talk about democracy at all, and it is not an issue. Human rights and all that stuff is Western, and they are hopeless. They cannot do it. So this is the 1990s, and both Huntington, of course, Huntington, we know that actually he's a card-carrying Democrat at the time, but still kind of a conservative view on civilization, and Francis Fukuyama as well. And this kind of talk, particularly Huntington direct position, has been adopted by many third worldists, both leaders in the third world and also a critical scholar who embrace the third worldist kind of agenda and adopt a kind of a radical relativism to argue against the universality of liberal democracy. And there's actually, before the Arab Spring, I had a quote from Gaddafi. At that time, he was a kind of darling among some left liberal circle, particularly, for example, David Hell in LSE, who write and say that Gaddafi is adopting and developing a new form of socialist democracy in Libya. And he explicitly said that liberal democracy can't fit North Africa and Africa because African societies are tribal society. They're all tribes. Every tribe has a leader. People only listen to the tribal leader. If you have a liberal democracy election at the national scale, there will be chaos. So you only can have a strongman and coordinating all these tribal leaders. So it is exactly what Gaddafi say. And of course, then you have a Russian version with Alexander Dogin, who is like Eurasianism. He'll advocate that Russia was weak when Russia tried to embrace Western institution, Western idea, democracy, and all that thing. But Russia is only strong when Russia get back to its Eurasian root, and it traces back to the Golden Horn, Mongol invasion, and all that. So basically, it is like Oriental despotism with a positive view on it, that we need to go back to Oriental despotism. And that needless to say, and China has a lot of the official propaganda about this kind of they have a campaign against universal values, actually rounding up scholars and lawyers who advocate there's certain kind of universal values anywhere. So they are advocating a kind of China exceptionalism, saying that any Western institutions or Western form of democratic governance is not suitable for China. China need to have its own role. So it is all this kind of a conservative talk in the 1990s in the West, and becoming kind of a quasi or pseudo progressive talks in the third world circle. And I trace back to this idea actually to the Jim Crow era in the U.S. That I'm kind of obsessed with that guy, Frank Goodnow, because he's the founding father of the American political science, and he is the first president of the American Political Science Association. And I'm obsessed with him and interested in him because also he's the president of my university in the 1910s and 1920s. When he first became the Johns Hopkins University president, coming from Columbia, teaching law, administrative law, and today is the APSA, the American Political Science Association, still have this Frank Goodnow Award. But then he has a moonlighting job in his first 2 years, being a Johns Hopkins president. He is the advisor to the Chinese president of the Chinese Republic. So it's a long history short that after 1911, Chinese has a revolution, declared republic, but then the idealist revolutionary has no guns. So they make a compromise with all these lawful warlords with guns, that if the warlords support the republic, they make him the president. So the first Chinese president is actually Yuan Shikai, who has a warlord from the imperial era, controlling all the military. And then after he became president, he hired Frank Goodnow to become his constitutional advisor to start rewriting the constitution. In the end, restoring monarchy, because he thinks that liberal democracy doesn't fit China. China needs an emperor, and it is bad to have a Chinese guy to say that. So it is better to hire a white guy to tell Chinese people that liberal democracy is bad for you. And then he published a memo and later a series of paper talking about democracy, and successful democracy has some requirement. The most important requirement is the people's intelligence. So only people with high intelligence can have democratic rights and have democratic system. So he talked about comparing North and South America, saying that why South America democracy failed because the people intelligence are low. North America people intelligence are high. But he doesn't define intelligence. He talk about education and all that stuff. So it's not necessarily implying genetic or anything. But then he's in the memo later translated into Chinese and circulate among the monarchies is that Chinese people have low intelligence. So if you have election, it will be chaos. So it is very common view at the time. He's not inventing this view because he's saying this thing in 1914, 1915. At that time, women didn't have the right to vote in the U.S. And then definitely in Jim Crow era, in the name of this kind of a literacy test, they denied minorities and African American voting right as well. And women, and the argument, you look at the argument against women vote, you see this propaganda. It's just saying that like women is like not rational enough to vote wisely. So it is the discourse at the time. So basically internally they disenfranchise women, minority, and people without property. Actually, that they only allow property people because property is the manifestation of intelligence. They don't allow these people to vote. Only white man, property right man can vote. And internationally, they advocate that some countries people have low intelligence, so they cannot have a liberal democratic system. Better to have dictatorship or monarchy. And later on, he write a book elaborating why he thinks Chinese have low intelligence, and it's not about genetic, but it's about the language, and it is the ridiculous theory that it is the Chinese language with all these characters. People using their manpower to memorize all these characters, then they don't have extra capacity to do reasoning. So it's another very common theory at the time. Even the early Communist Party of China advocate this theory. So it's why they have this language reform program and to get rid of the Chinese, first simplify the Chinese character and get rid of the Chinese character to turn it into a alphabet-based language. And Vietnam and South Korea also do it. So it is very common. So he didn't invent this theory, but it is a very common perception. So to fast forward to today, that we now know that this kind of and of course Woodrow Wilson talk about self-determination after the First World War. But he's actually only talking about self-determination of the white people after the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all that. And then he didn't mean self-determination for the dark-skinned people, colonized people, but then the people in Vietnam, in Korea, they pick up the idea and then ask for extending the principle of self-determination to them too. So it is this kind of self-determination, democratic right, voting is a white privilege or white man privilege or property right man privilege, has this racist, classist, and sexist origin. But then after a century of transmutation, it's very interesting that this kind of talk, now you hear it in this kind of multipolarity, relativism talk about this liberal democracy has its limit.
Ho-Fung, you're at time, so if you could just sum up.
Because the last sentence to conclude is that we need to find a way to strike the balance between this radical relativism that origin from a very racist view on liberal democracy and the very radical universalism of Francis Fukuyama type that's just saying that anything work in the Western world should be promoted forcefully or peacefully to the rest of the world to be the standard. Both are wrong. I can't say which one is right, which one is left, but we really need to find a way to find the middle ground regarding liberal democracy at the very least. But thank you. It's the end of my presentation.
I think Ranita is next. Yeah. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. This is Ranita Ray. I'm at the University of New Mexico. Thanks, Rebecca, for helping us pivot online, honoring the ASA boycott. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. So I'll try my best to keep it within, 5-6 minutes. Thanks to my co-panelists for presenting your insightful work. So I'm going to read, just so I don't go on. And I'm going to talk about a turn to the right in public education, K through 12 schools. Particularly, I'm going to focus on what the left gets wrong about teachers and why teachers versus fascists is a dangerous fantasy, and how that feeds into the broader turn to the right in the US. So as book bans, immigration raids inside schools, and attacks on teaching about race, gender spread across the country, K through 12 public education is once again cast into the political spotlight. Much of the liberal and even radical left has taken up a familiar line. Teachers are under attack. Teachers are holding the line. Teachers are the resistance. When ICE and Trump administration declared classrooms fair game for ICE raids and threatened the over 500,000 children in U.S. public schools who live without legal status, teachers were cast as the great saviors. And it is indeed true that many school districts and some educators are left scrambling for legal guidance, reassurance, and moral clarity as ICE raids schools. We're told this is a moment to rally behind educators, defend the institution of public schooling, and view the classroom as the last bulwark against fascism. It's a comforting narrative. But for those of us writing from within the Black radical, queer, and third world feminist theoretical perspectives and movement traditions, it is also dangerously misleading. Let's be clear. Schooling is not the same as education. The US school system has always functioned to discipline, assimilate, and sort its pupils. From Native American boarding schools to the forced pathologizing of Black and immigrant children, public schooling has never been neutral terrain. It has been a central site of state violence. And teachers have played and continue to play a key role in this. And yet, again and again, we're asked to believe that teachers as a class are allies, that they're victims, that they're trying their best, that they're too constrained by standards or overwhelmed by bureaucracy, or simply unaware of the harm they unleash. And that public schools are the last bastion of racial democracy and gender and class equality. But the numbers and history of schoolings and the stories we hear from all around tell us something different. As an example, in 2024, 37% of all public school teachers and 50% of teachers below the age of 40 plan to vote for Donald Trump. Of course, these are complex statistics, and voting behavior does not always align with what happens inside the classroom, but I found that this statistic often surprises people. 80% of public school teachers are also white, and this historically you can trace back to Brown v. Board. Well, after integration, white parents did not want their white children to learn from Black teachers, which led to the exit of Black teachers and admins from public schools. And despite the proliferation of diversity trainings, racial equity frameworks, and liberal anti-bias initiatives, anti-Blackness and xenophobia remains a daily feature of life inside US classrooms. You just Google and you see a plethora of stories to that effect. None of this should surprise us. White teachers are not a monolith, but they're embedded in and often loyal to the system that has always positioned them as caretakers of the state. We do ourselves and our movements a disservice when we flatten the political terrain, mistaking pity for solidarity, passivity for resistance, and liberal hand-wringing for a commitment to social justice. What does it mean that so many of us still assume teachers regret book bans, that they're invested in truth-telling about empire, heteronormative agenda, or anti-Blackness? What does it mean that we're still surprised when they aren't? I saw the everyday dark realities behind closed classroom doors when I spent 3 years from 2017 to 2020 during the first Trump era inside Las Vegas schools, shadowing a group of children from 4th to 6th grade in Las Vegas's Clark County School District. In the schools I studied, like the district, majority of the students are racially minoritized. They're oppressed by class, and also majority of them are immigrants. And what I saw inside Las Vegas classrooms during the first Trump era, and what I see and hear today as a parent tells us a more complex story, one that teachers versus fascist rhetoric does not fully explain. I witnessed teachers blaming illegals for the valley's declining educational achievement, teachers telling children, ask your parents to speak English at home if they want to stay in this country. A little girl sobbing for days after her father was deported until a teacher told her to get over it or face punishment. Or a paraprofessional mocked for her Asian accent, sparking a chorus of students to taunt children who spoke English as a second language. This is the daily reality. Students humiliated, shamed, marked as outsiders by the very adults tasked with protecting them. I watched patriotic rituals bleed into xenophobia, teachers declaring that America is the best country in the world while discouraging any student who questioned war, racism, or inequality. Even when kids connected, for example, Kaepernick's protest to Rosa Parks, a teacher sneered that Kaepernick was simply disrespecting our nation. These types of anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-Black everyday reality perpetuated often by teachers that build the infrastructure for student bullying inside the classroom was very common. So let's be honest, ICE raids, external attacks on DEI are only the headline grabbing tip of the iceberg. The deeper, slower violence is already eroding classrooms every day, pushing immigrant children out of learning, out of joy, out of trust. And this is nothing new. For example, in Educating for Empire, Cliff Stratton sort of looks at the history of how teachers and the curriculum has systematically disenfranchised minoritized students. Yes, teachers are underpaid, obviously. Yes, schools are underfunded, but those facts do not excuse the casual cruelty and nationalist gatekeeping that so often poison the classroom. The real crisis isn't about whether ICE shows up at the school door. It's about whether schools themselves have already taken on the role of ICE, policing who belongs and who does not, who is American enough, who must live in fear. This is the burden and this is the betrayal. And unless we confront it head on, the damage will last far longer than any raid or any right turn in the US. This refusal to grapple with the political contradictions of teaching has consequences. It shows up in how we prepare our teachers, how we organize inside schools, how we organize outside to protect public education, how we misrecognize white emotionality as radical commitment. It keeps us locked in a loop, reacting to each new wave of state repression and attack on public education, but failing to organize with clarity that these times demand. If we're serious about liberation, Black, queer, collective, then we must stop investing in the idea that teachers are inherently aligned with us, that they're a class. Many are not, some are, most are somewhere in between, complicit in ways that they do not or will not name. The point is not to demonize teachers. It is to understand the institution they work for and often defend. Teachers versus fascists is not the fight we're in. The actual fight is against the very logic, carcerality, whiteness, obedience, nationalism, that public education so efficiently reproduces and always has. The actual fight is recognizing white agency inside public schools. We don't need better stories about well-meaning white teachers. We need ruptures. We need organizing that refuses nostalgia for public education and instead imagines what it would mean to build spaces of learning rooted in Black life and queer logic and not state legitimacy. Public education is not neutral. Teachers are not apolitical or unilaterally left, and pity will not save us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranita. And your timer just went off. You have very good timing. Cihan, I think you're next. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So I'm Cihan Tugal, professor of sociology at University of California, Berkeley, and I'll try to share my screen. We'll see if this works.
Cihan, if you ask, oh, it works. Okay, great.
So, okay, everybody can see my screen now? Okay, yeah, I'll play the contrarian a bit. So it is true that in the last decade, the far right has made historic gains throughout the globe, but I will use the strongest cases of this serious surge. So I have no intention to downplay it, but I'll use the strongest cases to highlight what most of the other cases are still not developing in their own turfs, with occasional contrasts to the interwar surge. So what do I mean by the strongest cases? In my analysis, these are Israel, Turkey, and India, and secondarily Hungary, the Fidesz regime that was just deposed. And a comparison of these cases highlights four axes where they unevenly compare to each other and to other far-right regimes throughout the world. So first, institutional manipulation and dictatorial measures. Of course, this is what unites them rather than divides them. And this is common across the board. But when we look at the other axes, mass organization, developmental and welfare policies, and propensity and readiness of the far-right mass organizations for violence, then the cases are really different from each other. So just shortly, in terms of developmental and welfare policies, I would argue that the Turkish regime is most consistent and systematic among these four, not worldwide. In terms of mass organization, the Indian Sangh Parivar, the larger family of far-right organizations the BJP is a part of, Sangh Parivar is unparalleled in the whole world. And in terms of propensity and readiness for violence, the Israeli far-right is certainly the strongest, even though, Sangh Parivar is infamously strong on this, but not as it's not even comparable to the Israeli far-right. And the Turkish far-right is really like it's trailing them in this regard. It's not as serious. And when we look at Hungary, it's weaker than the other three in all of these regards, and hence, but it's also stronger than the rest of much of the rest of the far right in the rest of the world. The Hungarian Fidesz is, in terms of mass organization, in terms of welfare, developmental, state capitalist policies, and it's not very strong in terms of violence. So. This is what I'm working on basically for this paper, comparing all the far-right regimes in terms of the uninterrupted years they were in power. So 23, Turkey, 16, Hungary, and Israel. Of course, it's somewhat misleading to categorize countries like this, because the Israeli far-right, it's in and out of power, but it really dominates the scene. So, I mean, this table has its limits. But when we rank them in terms of these indicators, we see interesting patterns emerging. So there are many aspects of the argument, and I won't have time to talk about all of them. One thing I will highlight is that most cases of the far right are economically orthodox. So I will try to use that terming instead of neoliberal, because you can really stretch neoliberal to go in any direction, and you can call almost anything in the 21st century neoliberal. But when we look at economic orthodoxy and whether it is dented by state capitalism, then we see a very interesting pattern emerging even within the stronger cases. And this pattern is that if a case is less orthodox, it also resorts to less violence. And this does not necessarily end the regime. Okay, so here what I'm basically highlighting is the contrast between Turkey and Israel. And of course, I'm aware that almost all analysts emphasize how neoliberal we are, and which is correct. So I'm not countering that argument, but it is specifically those regimes that erode and at least rhetorically attack neoliberalism that stay in power through less reliance on violence. So Likud, of course, it's a very telling case. In terms of violence, it is, as I stated, unparalleled. And it is as telling that it remained visibly more economically orthodox than these other stronger cases, all three cases. And then some of the secondarily strong cases like Poland. Likud was more neoliberal than these. What's really interesting about Likud is that it is like publicly ideologically committed to economic orthodoxy. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, Netanyahu famously cited Milton Friedman to justify why, even though the Israeli state has the capacity to help poor people, it will not help poor people. Okay? So it's a part of its mission to not help poor people. And that was one of the reasons why it was voted out in 2021. And then when it came to power, I would argue in 2022, that is again one of the neglected reasons why it resorted to more mass violence, because mass violence is not only a way to put down minorities, it is also a way to keep the poor mobilized against minorities. So therefore, I'm going into the details of the AKP's capitalist miracle in this paper and elsewhere to show how it is able to mix and match economic orthodoxy with heterodox measures with state capitalism to stay in power. And of course, we can discuss what that state capitalism is, but I think I don't have much time. So I'll emphasize other aspects. Already zero. Okay, maybe just allow me like 2 minutes. So what I'm basically arguing is that Likud gains much more from basing its line on racial religious exclusion alone, and does not need economics-based consent of the lower classes as much as the AKP does. So basically what's happening is that Jewish lower classes, and especially the Mizrahim, gain so clearly, explicitly, and publicly from racial religious domination that Likud does not depend as much on their socioeconomic consent. But that doesn't mean economic consent is absent. Because racial religious domination has many economic payoffs for the Jewish lower classes, such as land grabs, even in the absence of universal pro-poor or pro-labor economic policies, whereas the AKP is pushed to enact as many of these, even though it's very uneven, of course. I'm not saying it's not neoliberal, it's not replacing neoliberalism. And then, based on that comparison, then I discuss how the Indian BJP has a frail hegemony because it stands in between these strengths and weaknesses of Likud and the Turkish AKP. And then I go into Eastern European cases in the paper, and I discuss why their gains never add up to a serious surge, as serious as the Indian BJP or the Turkish and the Israeli far right. And then I have this section on Western Europe and United States, where I am honestly more worried about their resources and the damage they can do than their capacity to build resilient fascistic regimes. But this doesn't mean they can't kill us or they can't kill people. Yeah, they can kill many people. They can kill more people than the Indian and Turkish far right, and if they want, even more than the Israeli far right. But unlike these three strong cases, they really can't build anything. And I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Dylan, you're up. Don't forget to introduce yourself. Cihan, can you pull down that screen share? There.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot for those papers. They were all of them really, really interesting. And what I think I'm going to do is just in the interest of time and also just in the interest of discussion, I'm just going to basically raise three kind of questions that I think cross-cut different papers. I guess I should introduce myself as well. I'm Dylan Riley. I do political sociology at Berkeley. So let me go through these questions and just to kick off our discussion. The first one I kind of would like to pose a little bit to Müge and Ranita, and it has to do with how we should think about higher education and K through 12 education in relationship to these politics. And I guess one thing that I think is important to emphasize is that education at all levels has been very, very profoundly linked to the process of neoliberalization. I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that that education and credentialism itself is one of the major legitimating structures of inequality in the current period. And I think, obviously, as Ranita shows most compellingly for the K through 12 case, it's also deeply racialized. What I wonder about is how to understand the relationship of the current right-wing attack on public education in particular. And what I'm thinking is, and I would just like to get your thoughts on this, I think what is happening in part is what I would characterize as a rightist attack on the legitimating structures of neoliberal inequality. I think that's most obvious at the higher ed level, but I think it goes down the ladder. And what I'm thinking about in terms of K through 12 is, I think it was, I think Stephen Miller has said some interesting things in this regard. In some ways, although I very much, I thought it was bracing Ranita's kind of unmasking of the of the reproductive and racist elements of public education at the K through 12 level. I think it's also true that the kind of female teacher is a figure of hate and loathing on the trumpet, and particularly Trumpist right. So how do we understand this kind of attack? On the higher ed level, I think it's in a way even more obvious in the sense that I think that the way that higher education has developed during the neoliberal era has exposed it to a huge potential critique from the right. And that critique in part is based on its entire funding model, on much of the hypocrisy that seems to be built into the system, and all of that, which raises just this strategic question about how do we think about defending public education at the same time as transforming it? Because obviously both projects have to move forward at the same time, and it's just unclear to me exactly how to link those two issues together. So that's sort of what I'd like to get you guys to talk about. Now, the second group of questions, I want to turn basically to Ho-Fung and Cihan's papers, and I just want to think about I mean, get you guys to talk to one another a little bit here. I think that in a sense you could say that the rights. I don't know whether Ho-Fung, I don't know whether necessarily agree with the designation of this as right, but there's something about what's going on today, I think, with the radical right. There's something very strange, which is that the innovation is happening in kind of semi-periphery, and then these things are sort of being adopted in the core areas of the capitalist world, or at least that's a suggestion that comes out of Cihan's paper. And I guess in a way, what Ho-Fung is saying is that it's the opposite. It's like these obviously, like the Chinese regime is essentially imitating an older racist discourse and incorporating it as a legitimating ideology. But there does seem to be something about the staying capacity of the far right as a political phenomenon in the non-core areas of the capitalist world. And I want to know a little bit more why that's the case. I suspect, and this is just a hypothesis, I suspect that it has a lot to do with the real problems that the sort of rich world has in creating a durable social right. And that is to say that this is obviously most clear in the Trump case, but if I'm understanding what Cihan's saying, it's also true in the Western European right as well. And the idea here, I think, behind what Cihan's argument is that, well, in compensation for that, you get actually a more violent policy, right? Which explains this fact that the more orthodox economic policies go together with greater violence. And I guess the question that I just have is, why is that the case? What is the thinking behind that? Does it have to do, is there something about the economic model that has run out of steam in the rich world? I mean, is a story about low growth rates? And conversely, in the Turkish case, for example, there's still an idea of national development that can be mobilizing in a way that is not the case in the West. I guess I'd just like to get you guys to think about those issues, if that makes sense. The third set of questions that I just wanted to think about a little bit, and I guess this is sort of for Samantha and Ranita, I suppose. And it is just a question, it's a question about race. I think it's really Samantha's paper which raises this most acutely for me. It's it's a super elegant comparison. It's very, very well done between Uttar Pradesh and Kerala. The question that I have, though, you sort of map that onto the idea of kind of like, well, in Uttar Pradesh, the BSP puts too much of its card on recognition. In Kerala, the CP puts too much of weight on redistribution. And this opens up possibilities for the right in different ways because the politics that they pursue is sort of missing that, the other dimension. And I guess my question is that it doesn't, like, in thinking about actually your material, however, and also I think this is true. I'd just like to get Ranita to think about this as well. I tend to think that race is very material. That is to say that there are really serious material interests that are linked into racial and caste differences. And that's particularly clear, I think, Samantha, in your paper, where you talk about the way, obviously, that the BJP is able to kind of make an appeal to the Dalits, not in class terms, but in very material terms. So the question that this raises for me is like, how, just in general, in articulating this problem, how do we think about the relationship between material interests and class interests and race, I guess? Like, how do we have a framework that brings these things together? Because I'm not particularly satisfied, I guess, by the sort of redistribution recognition couplet of things. I think it tends to understate the material elements of race, rather, not material elements of class, material elements of race. Okay, that's sort of what I've got. So I think maybe it'd be good to, let you guys talk and then open it up.
So I don't know if people will run out of energy at 12:30 or not, but let's just see if the audience has a few questions as well, and then our panelists maybe can respond to everybody at once. I mean, this is a little bit of self-interest, but while everyone's thinking of their questions, I have a question too. Well, we had this idea of like doing a set of talks on Turn to the Right, of which these, formerly ASA panels, but then everyone on this panel boycotted, so we moved it online. Anyway, but yeah, sometimes I'm wondering if we got the question wrong, about Turn to the Right. And these papers here today really have an interesting take on it. So, like, is there really a turn to the right in, the 2020s? I guess the papers here today have these really, diverse answers to it. For Ho-Fung, I guess, no, there's been, a right sort of, maybe not quite to the right, but anyway, some sort of, rightist ideology has always been a strategy that, people use. And then, and also, Ranita's paper is saying, like, no, it's not a turn to the right. Like, this racial ideology is sort of baked into the U.S. educational system. And then I guess Müge's is, like, clearly taking the position, or I don't know, the paper's not really taking a position, but just interesting to think about. Müge's paper is very much like, yeah, there's this current neoliberal shift, right? And our educational systems really are starting to look very different with this financialization and everything's like efficiency. And then I guess, yeah, Cihan's is somewhere kind of in the middle, but maybe towards Müge's paper in thinking about some of these more contemporary turn to the rights. And yeah, Samantha's is sort of there too. Anyway, yeah, can I just throw out that question too? Like, is there a recent turn to the right, or is this just, a continuing, some sort of underlying continuing trend that's something else, like Ranita's talking about, or maybe Ho-Fung is talking about, or is there like this really contemporary shift to the right? Are there other questions from the floor that people would like to toss out for our panelists? Just put on your video, raise your hand, wave something on the screen. Would anybody else like to jump in? Anybody have a question for the panelists? Okay, well, while you're thinking of them, let's let our panelists go ahead. Just for variety, let's go in the reverse order. So, Cihan, do you want to go first, and we'll go backwards, just for fun?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. So let me start with the direction of the imitation. I actually think both are right. It depends on what time frame you're looking at. If you're looking at it as Ho-Fung was doing in the last 130 years, I think there's no question that the semi-periphery is imitating the core, mostly. I mean, not always, but I mean, then you can go back to Arendt and saying, well, even, Arendt already said, the boomerang, and the boomerang effect. I mean, that's just Arendt. So yeah, you first try things in the colonies and then implement them in the core. But in terms of, like a full-fledged fascist ideology, racist ideology, these are first developed in the core and then they migrate to the semi-periphery. But I think right now, in the last 10 to 20 years, the core is imitating the semi-periphery. But I wouldn't exaggerate this because they want to imitate them, but they don't take them very seriously. I mean, after all, they are the inferior peoples, right? I mean, who among the top right-wing scholars would take the Hungarian far right or the Turkish far right or the Indian far right seriously as people and empathize with them and study them? I mean, it's out of question. I mean, their imitation is very superficial. So they just, steal a bunch of keywords, do similar things, but they don't want to go into the depth of it and study it and then, implement it wholesale here. So I don't think that's happening, but they are, doing their imitation to the best of their abilities. And then there's this interesting structural question of why we see less state capitalism in the core. I think the answer to this is going to be as long as a book. So I don't think I can give a good short answer. But my answer over the years actually used many of Ho-Fung's critique of Chinese capitalism. So there is I didn't bring in China here because my table was restricted to electorally competitive cases. So there is no Russia there either. But in my mind, there's no question that there is no stronger state capitalism than Chinese capitalism right now in the whole world. And even that is a part of the global neoliberal order. So unlike the fascists and the Nazis, they're not really destroying the global market system. And there are many reasons for this, and that's why this can't be a short answer. And the other thing I would like to highlight is that we shouldn't really exaggerate the state capitalism in Turkey, Poland, and Hungary, because they're way more limited than the state capitalism in China. They're more comparable to Russia, but even then, I mean, that itself is like a mixture of state capitalism with neoliberalism, with crony capitalism. So, and in all of these regards, these cases are similar, more similar to Russia. I have other thoughts, but I want to respect people's time, so I'll just let it go.
Ranita, since we're going backwards.
Thank you, Dylan, for those, great question. And I'm not going to pretend I actually have like a succinct, gift wrapped answer, because those are things that I've been pondering and thinking about. But yes, I'm thinking about Cedric Robinson, and I'm thinking about the historical roots, and race and material interest. Um, and I think about the white agency and white imagination, particularly when it comes to K through 12 and higher ed as well, and to some of like Müge's points. And while you were talking, I was thinking about the role that higher ed plays in K through 12, racialized class education, in that how they train teachers, the curriculum they design, and other ways they shape the infrastructure, and mimic the infrastructure, each other's infrastructure as well. But then I'm thinking about like Trump and, the rhetoric of class interests, and this sort of like class betrayal, and and no shade against emotional labor, crap. You know who I'm talking about, right? Uh, I don't know why I'm blanking. We haven't had childcare for a while, so anyway, so you know who I'm talking about.
Hochschild.
Yes, Hochschild. Yes, no shade against Hochschild, but I think this sort of like academia's white imagination of Trump and class interests is telling. And the fact that there are actually white people who would like cut their nose to spite their face because they don't like migrants and Black people and Indigenous people, that part of it gets erased. And I'm also thinking about Jonathan Kahn's book, Race on the Brain, and how this sort of like public schools are democratizing institutions, and if only we could mitigate inequality inside them, then we would have racial democracy. And is part of this white imagination, where we have to make questions of race palatable in some way. And hence, when class becomes this mitigating force, right? Of course, race and material interests, and Cedric Robinson, like racial capitalism, that part is there. But also there is this another life, right? In this afterlife of slavery, in the settler colony, there's another meaning of race, ideological and material, that is deeply intertwined with the question of class, no doubt, and material interest, no doubt, but also has its own independent force. And then even if it does not, like I haven't made up my mind there, and I'm still, but I think about the role of white agency, even if it comes to material interest, right? And this part of white agency gets erased when as if whiteness becomes neutral as soon as we think of class interests, or some sort of like salvation for that. So that's part of like what I think about when I think about race and material interest, and white agency. And I think this question of white women teachers, right, making up 60-70% of public school teachers, and the far right attack there, I immediately think about white femininity and state agency, and as like state agents. And I'm thinking about Native American boarding schools and all of that stuff, and white women as like tasked with Americanization. And I was doing this talk one time, and I had this talk on like feminist analysis of school, and I talked solely about race, and I got this question like, why are you talking about race? This is feminism. But I think we cannot understand white womanhood without race. So even this attack on public education from the far right is racialized in some way, perhaps because for whatever reason, public education sparks this ignorant far right imagination of like radical education, which is like untrue. When people come to me, they're like, oh, professors are all radical left wing. You haven't seen shit. Like, that is not true. Case in point, ASA. But so it's complex, and that's where the thing is, because like I don't want to attack teachers union and teachers, right? and that's where, and I think that's the space that this moment has created, where where I'm supposed to apparently see eye to eye, with like far-right attack on public education, but also, is there ever going to be a right time to think about the historical roots of public education and public schools as state agents? And maybe this is perhaps the right. And when I was writing my book, my editor is like, I don't feel comfortable, but also, when is the right time to think about public education as state agency, or higher ed as part of state agents? And what Rebecca was thinking about, I think that in this afterlife of slavery and settler colony, it's a fertile ground for demagogues, right? Trump to take over, and this ideology takes hold because of the conditions that pre-existent. I'm thinking about Samantha's, the points that you were making about Modi and all of that as well, which, ties in nicely with that.
To be a quick response about this, is it me? I think it is me, that the order. The core imitating semi-periphery or semi-periphery imitating core, definitely now in the age of like the core of right, I would say more narrowly, not right wing or left wing, but kind of a inequality defending authoritarian figures. I would say that in the core, like MAGA and Trump, that definitely explicitly talk about good thing about Erdogan, Orban, and Xi Jinping. Actually, that there's a lot of anti-China racism rhetoric in Trump, but then you look closer, he has a whole career of praising the China model. Like how efficient it is. You don't need environmental assessment, auditing to build stuff, and the German chancellor then merge after coming back to China and then give a lecturing the union people and saying, you guys are talking about 4 days work weeks and work-life balance. I just come back from China. The people work like there's low leisure at all, and then they never complain, which is not true. Then in China, there's a whole movement and everyday life resistance against all these kind of work culture. But then to these right-leaning people, there's really a fascination. And even to some left-wing people, you look at the book Abundance, there's a fascination about how China built a high-speed rail. You just don't do lawsuit, you don't ask questions, you don't just build. So that is definitely in this regard, that is this kind of imitation of semi-periphery. And to the question about why this right-wing or inequality defending authoritarian system is more durable in some place and other, why it is surging in the core. So I'm a big fan of this theory about how this democratic polity need to be maintained through a lot of resources. And alluding to the Dylan's thesis or works about this democratic overloading, that you have a democratic system, everybody may claim, and actually it can be very unstable if it is in a country that has less resources, and then it will lead to breakdown, authoritarian backsliding and stuff. And if you're in a core country, you have an empire, you can suck in service from all around the world, so you can make all these class compromise when there's a demand from different parts of the population. So it is democratic politics can be more stable in this resourceful. And then why it is surging in the US and in the West now, and Europe is obvious. It is the economy is in stagnation, so it is no longer that much resource to cater for the demands for all kind of people. And US is in a similar situation. The stock market is booming, but only benefit the few, and then huge inequality. And then in this kind of structure, and also the productivity and everything else, and it is definitely this anxiety about competition with China. US is declining economically, and national debt and all that. So the dynamic change, and so it might be why. But it's just a hypothesis, and somebody might have already worked on it to this comparison, or if not, then somebody needs to work on it. Maybe myself in the years ahead, maybe somewhere else. But it is my quick answer.
Thank you. Well, I was thinking along these lines of the center periphery and which direction there is, and I think I mean, in a way similar to Arendt's boomerang, but yet in a different way. I think the emergence of finance, especially financialization, is extremely important in that context, because it totally goes beyond national boundaries and makes the entire system very liquid and very penetrable as well. I mean, I talk to my brother sometimes, and he says he avidly watches what's going on in the United States, because that is exactly what determines what goes on in the markets, in Turkey. I mean, so there is this kind, and you can also park your money all over. You have the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, sort of emerging as a thing. And I think all of these developments undergird and destabilize nation state formation on the one side. And the other one is, of course, communication revolution and the social media, smartphones and everything, is that people also now can participate as citizens, not only in their own countries, but as global citizens all over the world through these platforms. And I think that means the dynamics have changed. So I think that rather than seeing it as center and periphery, maybe it will be better to see it as a process, an interactive process that sort of goes back and forth. And in Arendt's case, I mean, then there were the colonies. It was hard to sort of know what was going on in the colonies until they physically sort of came to the center. But if you think about it now, because of information flows, we can exactly know what's going on in whatever part of the world, literally, within a minute, if not less. And that, I think, changes the conversation very much. Turning to higher education, I totally agree with Ranita. There is, of course, I didn't go into it. There is a racial element to this whole thing too. What at least my reading is that, there was some liberalization of higher education somewhat, in the 60s, with all the movements and everything. At least there was sort of an attempt to acknowledge the whiteness. But I think what has happened since then is you see this transformation from white men sort of being in positions of power, and then that is now transformed to white women. I mean, that is, at least if you look at most of the administrators now at the University of Michigan, or even in our department, they're literally exclusively white women, both administrators and department leaders and such. And I think that is an important shift. And the problems we're having here and elsewhere is the next transformation from sort of white men and women to non-white men and women. And if you go there, I mean, of course, I would argue it's first going to be non-white men before women. I mean, so there is a gender element there. And I'm not even bringing in sexuality. I mean, that I think is even going to be sort of the next one down because of this hierarchy of privilege when it comes to race. What to do going forward? I mean, the one thing I immediately thought of, given, Trump's, of course, measures do not help. I mean, we had to immediately, the university here sort of got rid of all of its diversity programs, changed their names, pulled the resources out and everything. I mean, they basically negotiated and then dealt with it rather than, taking a stand and saying, go take a hike. Well, why couldn't they? Because of finances, of course, because of all these federal contracts. That is another way, at least, Trump weaponized finances, resources, and once you pull those out, thousands of people who work on research labs lost their jobs. I mean, this was more, I think, at universities like University of Virginia than Michigan, but we also were impacted adversely by it. The first thing that came to my mind is unionization. I mean, so I sort of approached, now they are, Michigan, very much, they're saying it, oh no, we cannot, like, you have to use your other Gmail and, you cannot tell anybody, and everyone is sort of under, scrutiny, which I was surprised by. And when I was talking to them, they said that the hardest thing they had was faculty do not see themselves as a part of the working class. I mean, or, that their labor literally is what they contract, and they show their labor by teaching and research and such. I mean, but they do not see themselves as belonging to that class. They rather think they're entrepreneurs or, people, who are sort of close to, I guess, business people in one way or another. And that, of course, is the greatest fall and problem, I think, with faculty in general, is that they are not aware of their class interests. So how we change that? Probably through unionization, I hope. And also, as well, if you think about the larger picture in the United States, hopefully by getting closer to democratic socialism than this like right-wing, hegemony that Trump is trying to build. And I'll leave at that. Thank you.
Sam?
Are we out of time?
That's okay.
Okay.
Go
All right.
ahead. We can, I actually scheduled it till 1 if, but some people may get tired.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Dylan. I really appreciate the question about the relationship between class and race, something I've thought about a lot. The first thing I'll say is that I tend to generally accept Stuart Hall's framework that people tend to experience class through the lens of ethnicity or race. And in the Indian case, it would be caste. And so we have to take that, seriously and ask how people subjectively experience, class contradictions. The way I like to frame it is the class dimensions of caste or race. And the second thing I'll say, which relates to that point, is that misrecognition is always bound up in maldistribution, right? So while that's true, these injustices don't always have equal weight in every, circumstance. So something that I found in my semi-structured interviews and ethnography, where I was, asking people why they defected from the left parties and the BSP to the BJP, is that, Dalit rank and file residents disproportionately emphasize material grievances, while, cadres/leaders tended to talk more about misrecognition. And in the book, I really try to show how these, different grievances, which affect different sections of the population, are really mobilized and combined in a single war of position that's being led by the far right, the BJP. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, which I think supports your point, Dylan, about the relative importance of class, is that the rank and file, the residents that I interviewed are a much larger portion of the population, right? And that's one of the main reasons why the BJP is able to make much more rapid inroads in the UP context, where there wasn't a redistributive program to speak of, right? And there's a much more precipitous defection of Dalits to the right wing than there is in Kerala, where there was a robust social welfare, state constructed. So yeah, this is something I flesh out more in the book. Maybe it didn't really come through in the paper, but yeah, I appreciate the questions.
Does anybody from the audience want to ask our panelists anything? Any other questions, comments? Everyone's in summer mode. Okay, then if nobody has, yeah, Jacob, go for it.
Okay, sorry, I was looking for the raise my hand button.
That's okay.
So my question is, to what extent do you think democratic institutions are being used as a kind of window dressing to establish a kind of global police state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone want to bite at that? Any of the panelists?
The global police state, I'm not sure what is the definition of it. Definitely in a kind of a neo-conservative mode that is this kind of exporting democratic regime through military invasion. So it was in 2000s, like Dick Cheney and George W. Bush era. But I would my kind of instant response to this is that the MAGA kind of right wing right now, we don't see this variation yet, at least. That of course, but then even on what the current government have done to Venezuela and Iran, so they never in the language of exporting democracy. So they are very ready to talk with any dictators, and just like a dictator who want to sell oil to the U.S., make deals, and is a good dictator. So it's a different variation right now. Of course, that they even talk less about rights and liberal democracy at home. Why talk about it abroad? So it is a kind of more transactional, economic, financial kind of mode of foreign policy. That, but I don't rule out the ideas that on democratic sides and Democratic Party sides and on many other forces, then the new conservative kind of thinking is still around. It can come back, but maybe not right now.
I was thinking that maybe if you think of democracy in the context of the state as this checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and the judiciary, I mean, what we're seeing, I think, but Cihan will know this better than I do, obviously, comparatively, is that the executive it has taken over the legislative and the judiciary totally. I mean, at least in our case, I mean, I'm shocked at how little the legislative cannot do anything. I mean, they're totally sidelined. And the judiciary is trying very hard to contain it at various levels, but the Supreme Court is compromised. So that I think what we see with respect to state and how democracy is supposed to operate in the context of the state, we have a semblance of democracy in the sense that these people exist. They're still as their sort of branches and their own organizations, but in praxis, the power is continuously, concentrated on the executive in a very undemocratic way. Trump literally decides everything himself, and we don't even know what his decision-making process is either. So I don't know, what democracy. The only thing we seem to have as citizens is that we're exploited as taxpayers because he's around doing things, with our money technically. And what do we have to hold? In democracies, you're supposed to hold people accountable for their actions. The only thing we have left is the voting power. I mean, and there's nothing else. I mean, in Turkey, it's even more distressing because, I mean, I don't think they even, the presidential system, so to speak, already co-opted both the legislative and the judiciary, making it much harder to make some change. So we'll see how it is going forward. But I do agree. Yes, democracy has been, weaponized, I think. Yeah.
I added a link to an article where I addressed this question specifically. So this was like 2 comments ago. So I'm calling what some regimes are building democratic autocracy. And I agree with Müge and Ho-Fung as far as Western Europe and the United States go. So they're using, democratic rhetoric to do undemocratic things. But when it comes to Hungary, Israel, Turkey and India, I think the answer is more complex because I think my argument in that article is that what they're doing is deeply democratic, but this is democracy in the fascist sense. So this is what, the interwar right-wing thinkers understood democracy to be. So Dylan called this authoritarian democracy, and I'm discussing in the article why I'm not calling it that and playing around with the term. But basically, the answer is that they are building, as Orban himself called it, an illiberal democracy. In the sense that, for example, as Sam's research shows, actually, they are mobilizing and integrating people who have not been mobilized and integrated into the system. So they're enlarging democracy to crush other people's democratic participation.
Okay, are there any last comments or questions, or does anybody else want to jump in? Oh, we're all good? Okay, let's give a round of applause to our panelists and speakers, and thanks for everybody for joining us here on Zoom and for letting us move this session. And yeah, I think I can stop the recording. Thanks, everyone. That was really great.